In the previous lecture, I noted that consciousness becomes a still more complex phenomenon when considered in the context of self-consciousness. Clearly, we have a problem. Well, perhaps it's time to break the news of what, to many beyond the reach of the graduate seminar, may come as a surprise. Namely, it is the considered judgment of today's leading philosophers that the core problem in that specialty called philosophy of mind just is the problem of consciousness. Listen to the philosopher John Searle on this point. Quote, "The most important scientific discovery of the present era will come when someone, or some group, discovers the answer to the following question: how exactly do neurobiological processes in the brain cause consciousness?" Close quote. In his Facing Up to the Problem of Consciousness, David Chalmers says straight away, quote, "Consciousness poses the most baffling problem in the science of the mind. There is nothing that we know more intimately than conscious experience, but there is nothing that is harder to explain." Close quote. Now, I quickly add that this same problem plagues specialists in fields as wide-ranging as theoretical physics and computer science, and may include more than a few theologians and ethicists. So, what's the problem? Let's begin by acknowledging that in our day-to-day affairs, however we might identify ourselves by way of jobs or professions or vocations, we generally have no problem with consciousness. We scarcely think about it. Arguably, it's the most taken-for-granted condition of life. Even after the nightly sleep, during which time we've lost consciousness, it would be the more philosophically or maybe neurotically inclined who would have, as the first thought on awakening, "Alas, my consciousness has been restored." It's so natural that even children who may be utterly perplexed by the question of where they came from or why the sky is blue generally require no explanation whatever for the daily cycles of wakefulness and sleep, conscious life, and lengthy time-outs. Sleep produces what we take to be a natural, even needed loss of consciousness, and grave trauma or disease will produce an unnatural loss of consciousness. But apart from these occasions, consciousness itself seems no more problematical than our breathing. In one interesting respect, what is unusual about consciousness being a weighty problem in philosophy is that except for technical work in logic and philosophy of science, the problems of philosophy generally arise from matters that really do form part of the daily concerns of the average person. When we say in the course of a conversation something along the lines of, "I may be wrong, but it seems to me," we record our awareness of the warrants we have for being certain about some matters. For example, "I have a toothache," as opposed to the confidence we're allowed to have in our mere conjectures. For example, "You seem to have a toothache." To put the point in academic terms, we can say that daily life presents us with problems of an epistemological nature. And it's one of the recognized tasks of philosophy to analyze the grounds of our knowledge opinions, our knowledge claims, our beliefs. Consider also the ethical issues that arise within the course of a single day. Have I been fair and considerate in my behavior toward others? Am I failing in my responsibilities out of laziness or selfishness? Should I have agreed with Jack when he argued for a position I really disagree with? Was it right to get out of an engagement by way of a headache that wasn't really that severe? Shouldn't we invite the Smiths before we accept another invitation from them? Do I praise my children beyond their actual merits? Now, questions such as these are not burning questions, but they do call for our attention because they're drawn from recognizable moral categories that sometimes do raise burning questions. Questions of life and death, questions in which one's self-regarding motives may be at significant cost to others. And obviously questions of this nature should engage, and have engaged, the energies of whole generations of philosophers in the fields of ethics, philosophy of law, moral philosophy. Consciousness is, as I say, different in this respect, for it is at once entirely unproblematical for the ordinary person, but a source of continuing vexation for philosophy, as well as for specialists and scholars in several other areas. Let me not foreclose debate here. When we find an issue that tests the powers of highly developed disciplines, but causes no difficulty whatever at the level of daily life, we might be tempted to conclude that here again, the plain folk just don't have the wits to see a real problem when there is one. However, there is another possibility, namely that whatever it is that has resulted in the development of these disciplines, it is either misapplied to non-disciplinary contexts or is burdened by a problem largely of their own making. Well, setting that aside for now, let's begin with theoretical physics and ask just what it is about consciousness that a physicist should even consider, let alone worry about. I shall take this up more closely in a later lecture on consciousness and physics, but here let me briefly point to the dilemma caused by the facts of consciousness. In the 18th century, at the height of the French Enlightenment, the scientific achievements of the previous century, the century of Newton and Galileo, the leaders of thought were persuaded that no problem was inaccessible to the methods and perspectives of the new physics. Pierre-Simon Laplace, born in 1749, and a productive mathematician and philosopher till his death in 1827, summed up the confidence of an entire age when he claimed that if we had complete knowledge of the position and velocity of every particle in the universe, well, the direct application of Newton's laws would allow us to predict perfectly every future event. Here's how he stated it in his famous philosophical essay on probabilities. Quote, "We may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future. An intellect which at a certain moment would know all forces that set nature in motion, and all positions of all items of which nature is composed. If this intellect were also vast enough to submit these data to analysis, it would embrace in a single formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the tiniest atoms. For such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes." Close quote. The intellect envisaged by Laplace, the entity that later would be dubbed Laplace's demon, is not some very bright physicist at Caltech or MIT, nor is it something likely to be confused with our own human intellect. Think of it instead as a supercomputer, programmed with the physical dynamics of everything. That is to say, everything. It is to Laplace's lasting credit that, recognizing such complete knowledge to be beyond the reach of human powers, he shifted his focus and contributed significantly to that very theory of probability that permits scientific prediction in the face of incomplete knowledge. But his bottom line, so to speak, shared by any number of leading scientists today, is captured in the maxim, "Physics is complete," even if our comprehension of its completeness would be forever imperfect. Well, this idea is ancient, of course. The Greek atomists, Leucippus and his student Democritus, stood behind the proposition that all of reality is exhausted by invisibly small physical particles and the spaces between them. The word atom, after all, in its Greek etymology, refers to that which cannot be cut any further, atomos, that which is ultimately small. This view, taken quite seriously in the middle of the 5th century BC, has waxed and waned in its influence on later ages. But it has always seemed to be redeemed by every stage in the progress of science. Epochs dominated by the confident belief that one thing or another could never be explained or accomplished were sooner or later superseded by ages of scientific discoveries that made the old impossibilities seem like child's play. As articles of faith go, then, confidence in what science may ultimately explain is no mark of village credulity, but a plausible degree of confidence in that horse that has a habit of winning all the big races. Well, what does it mean to say that physics is complete? To begin with, it is to adopt a metaphysical position which can be classified as an ism, and in this case, the ism is physicalism. It is to adopt the position that the only and ultimate reality is physical, that everything is substantially physical in the traditional sense of substance, to which I will turn shortly. But first, some words about metaphysics, for it's one of those words that too often is permitted to mean nearly anything the speaker chooses. Its origin, however, is quite innocent. Commentators in the 1st and 2nd centuries A.D., in possession of works by Aristotle, assigned titles to Aristotle's treatises. One of these treatises referred to work just completed by Aristotle in his Lyceum, work on what we would translate as natural science or as physics, physis, but physics in a very broad sense. Thus, the work that followed this one in time, the work next undertaken, was rather innocently classified by commentators as meta ta physica, meaning no more than after the treatise on nature. The work itself, however, is among the least innocent in the entire library of philosophical thought. It is the pioneering work in metaphysics, and its influence can be described as nothing less than current. Aristotle declares its subject matter to be that of real being, an inquiry into what really is, combined with a critical examination of the grounds on which we may claim to know this, or for that matter know anything. It's worth pointing out that the very first book of the Metaphysics might well qualify as the first actual history of philosophy composed by a person of known identity. For in that, Aristotle reviews what others have said about the topics to be addressed, and though some he cites are clearly opponents of his own views, his coverage is fair and as thorough as would be expected in such summaries. The very opening lines of the work are disarmingly direct. Aristotle says, "All men by nature desire to know." An example of this is the delight we take in our senses. He insists that this very delight is not based solely on usefulness. Rather, our sensory commerce with the world and the knowledge thereby obtained will generate delight from the sheer activity itself, he says. The desire to know, however, is not satisfied merely through sensory experiences. Rather, we regard ourselves as knowing about things and events when we understand what brings them about and how they are related to other things and events. It's in Book 1 that Aristotle refers to those very causes previously discussed in the treatise on natural science, the physis, which carefully distinguishes among the different senses of causation. And it will be useful to review this briefly. Now, Aristotle's conception of causality continues to provide philosophy with grist for productive argument and analysis. Let's take as a way of illustrating his conception of an ordinary object, say a coffee cup. We're called upon to answer the question, what's the cause of this coffee cup? Now, clearly, for it to have been brought about at all, there must be some sort of matter capable of being worked on, capable of holding its shape, etc. Now, if what we mean by the cause of something must include whatever is necessary for a thing to exist at all, then surely in one sense the cause of the coffee cup is the matter of which it is composed. Thus does Aristotle include material causes among the causes of any object. Now, noting the difference between a pile of bricks and a house, Aristotle goes on to point out that mere clumps of matter are insufficient to explain causality as associated with actual things. In our example, the raw material comes to be recognized as a coffee cup in virtue of having the proper shape, the right form. Now, if an object is a cup, if and only if it has a form of a certain kind, then one of the necessary conditions that must be satisfied for it to be a cup just is a form. And this is the sense in which Aristotle refers to the formal cause of something. In his treatise on physics or natural science, Aristotle reminds us that, he puts it this way, if the art of shipbuilding were in the wood, we would have ships by nature. What he makes clear is that one will never see an Athenian trireme with its leather sails, its vertically arranged levels of oarsmen, its sharply honed planks, coming about simply as a result of natural forces working on matter over long periods of time. If you wish to have a trireme, it must be built. That is, skilled craftsmen must set to work on the material components and fashion them into the very form of a trireme. Each of the cuts in the wood, each blow of the hammers, each rope that stretches the sails is a causal element in fashioning the end product. Each of these steps effects a desired alteration in the material. Each enters into what Aristotle calls the efficient cause of the resulting ship. But how does each worker know what to do? How do all of them, once their respective tasks are completed, produce the ship? Obviously, they're all working from plans. They are realizing a vision or blueprint originally formulated by the ship's designer. In the order of time, this blueprint is realized last, though in the order of conception, it is the first. It comes before the choice of materials and the choice of fashioning these into a given form. All of these subsidiary causal ingredients are to be understood as bringing about an object that serves a purpose, that allows a goal to be attained. To understand what the final object is requires that we know what it's for, what its function is, what its purpose or goal, what purpose or goal it serves. And this is what the ship's designer contemplated at the outset, and what the material, formal, and efficient causes ultimately led to. This ultimate plan and purpose is what Aristotle called the final cause, which, we might say, is the very reason behind the thing itself. Rejected in this account is the older Platonic teaching according to which the form of a thing is actually separate from the thing itself. As Aristotle says, it would seem impossible that the substance, and that of which it is a substance, should exist apart. We soon recognize, even before the conclusion of Book 1, that this desire we have to know, and this delight we take in our senses, scarcely will touch that central issue to which Aristotle's metaphysics is devoted, the issue of just what has real being. And on this question, the limits of sense-based knowledge become evident. Let's now get back to the question of substance, which I said I'd return to. To say that, for example, physicalism regards all really existing things to be substantially physical is to invoke the notion of substance, and this invites us back into the pages of Aristotle's treatise. It is in Book 7, Part 1 of the Metaphysics that he explains the substance of a thing. He begins the section this way: there are several senses in which a thing may be said to be. For in one sense, the being meant is what a thing is, or a this. And in another sense, it means a quality or quantity, or one of the other things that are predicated as these are. While being has all these senses, obviously that which is primarily is the what which indicates the substance of the thing, close quote. He notes that such properties as walking and being healthy do exist as properties, but only in virtue of something primary. He says, it is that which walks or sits or is healthy that is an existent thing. Now these are seen to be more real because there's something definite which underlies them, that is, the substance or individual. Clearly, then, it is in virtue of this that each of the others also is. Therefore, that which is primarily, that is, not in a qualified sense, but without qualification, must be substance. Aristotle. Well, later in Part 13, he amplifies this main point, taking the substance of a thing to be, quote, that which is peculiar to it, which does not belong to anything else, close quote. And then goes on to say that, quote, substance means that which is not predicable of a subject, close quote. We can say that Mary has a pain. We cannot say that a pain has Mary. Mary's substantial self on this account is unique. It can be qualified by any number of predicates. Mary is Irish, Mary is fond of Schubert, Mary is late for the opera. But Mary is not a predicate qualifying some other subject. Now, if the phrase physics is complete means that any and every entity to which real predicates are applicable is itself a physical substance in this sense of substance, and if all predication in reality includes only physical properties, then the problem of consciousness is just one more problem to be solved by whom? By physicists. If, however, consciousness is just a code word for an entity whose substantial nature is self-reflecting mental life, itself not reducible to anything physical, then the problem of consciousness is beyond the reach of physical analysis, and alas, guessed what? Physics is not complete, which is to say that any complete account of reality cannot be rendered solely in physical terms. Well, what does Aristotle say? In Part 6 of Book 12, he gets to the heart of the matter, reducing the possible kinds of real entities to three. One kind is in the category of the sensible, in that its being is readily established through perception. This might require all the aids to perception that technology can produce, including electron microscopes, the Hubble telescope, etc. Of these sensibles, some are permanent, such as the planets, whereas yet a second class includes things that come and go, such as plants and animals. All this, for Aristotle, comes under the heading of the physical, and it is to be explained by physical science. The third class of real things is different, and comes under the heading of what Aristotle refers to as the unmovable, changeless over time, and essentially what it is. Regarding this class, he says, quote, we must assert that it is necessary that there should be an eternal unmovable substance. For substances are the first of existing things, and if they are all destructible, all things are destructible. But it is impossible that movement should either have come into being or cease to be, for it must always have existed, or that time should, for there could not be a before and an after if time did not exist. Movement also is continuous, then, in the sense in which time is. There must then be such a principle whose very essence is actuality. Further, then, these substances must be without matter, for they must be eternal, if anything is eternal. Therefore, they must be actuality. Close quote. Well, here this ancient philosopher teases us from the distance of about 350 BC with an ontology, a study or science of real being that includes as necessities actual immaterial substances that constitute the starting point for all that will be in the realm of the changeable, all that moves in time. Well, Aristotle aside, but with his suggestive ideas as a prompt, we might say that consciousness is just that immovable substance, so to speak, within the framework of which all change, all sensibles, all spatio-temporal affairs unfold and gained their real existence. Was this not the reasoning that led George Berkeley early in the 18th century to conclude that the real material physical world requires for its subsistence a representation in mind? Was this not what Berkeley was getting at when insisting that esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived? After all, what can be meant by a blue sky, a ripe tomato, or the planet Jupiter, except as a constellation of experiences? On Berkeley's account, what is anything if not a set of perceptible properties? Now, tied to our current topic, we might ask, what is anything if not a representation in some consciousness? It might be a good time to pause to take stock of the basic kinds of substances on offer so far as we try to get a firm grasp of consciousness and its problematic nature. As I indicated earlier, the question at this point is an ontological question, a question about just what has real being, just what we can say really exists. The Greek verb to be is enai. The Greek for being is on. We'd spell it on, the genitive of which is ontis. So the subject of ontology just is that of being. If physics is complete, we are then committed to a monistic ontology, in this case, monistic materialism. The problem of consciousness is just one of discovering the manner in which entirely physical things and combinations of physical things come to generate a physical state or condition which we now call consciousness. If, however, with George Berkeley, we find the most telling arguments being those that deny the independent reality of matter and require of the seemingly material world that foundational reality that is mind, then we retain a monistic ontology, but in this case we would call it monistic idealism. Real existence now being in the form of idea. The problem of consciousness now reverses itself. Now the task is one of accounting for the indubitable success at the practical level achieved on the assumption that there is indeed a mind-independent physical reality governed by laws, the adequacy of which has nothing to do with us or our ideas. This all seems extreme, so we tend toward a more common sense position, an ontology that we call dualism. There really is a physical world independent of us. There really is a mental world of consciousness and its contents. Now we can argue fruitfully about how or if these two distinct ontological domains are related. But that there are at least these two we regard as, I say at the common sense level, obvious. Well, obvious until we press on with searching questions about just what kind of stuff this mental stuff is. If, as our common sense ontology requires, it is immaterial, then we have the daunting question of just how an immaterial desire to raise my arm leads to my arm being raised. Equally daunting are questions of this sort. How can the physical discharges in the fibers of my optic nerve cause the immaterial conscious awareness of blue light? Somewhere in this mix of questions and confident answers, for those who have adopted one or another solution to the problem of consciousness have in common a rather surprising confidence, there seems to be assumptions that have not had the benefit of serious challenge. It is not unusual for us to solve any number of problems by ignoring the real problem and then developing a sound solution to what in fact is a very different problem. It's not unusual for us to assume that a solution must be of a given sort, for were it otherwise we would face still other problems. Mind you, when witches were being arrested for heresy, it was a matter of concern to be sure that the evidence of guilt was compelling. There was, we see, the problem of correctly identifying witches. On the assumption that such persons, owing to their pact with the devil, would present clear symptoms, such as the inability to form tears, it became possible to develop standard procedures. The tests themselves were standardized, competently administered. There was an unnoticed problem here, however, namely, there are no witches. Well, in succeeding lectures, I will trot out all sorts of candidate solutions and candidate problems, and yes, candidate evidence. I think we'll agree that some of it, even that which seems so leading edge, is more akin to witches and their dry eye than to NASA and the Apollo program. The task of science here, as elsewhere, is that of explanation. As I shall make clear in the next lecture, where consciousness is our subject, there seems to be something of a gap, an explanatory gap, raising questions about how best to fill it in.